Well, welcome back to Sacred Healing and Wholeness, where biblical truth and mental health science work together in harmony. I am Pastor Amy, and I'm so grateful that you've chosen to spend this time with me this evening. And for those who may be joining for the first time, just for the record, I've served in pastoral ministry for more than 2 decades. Alongside ministry, I have earned multiple degrees in psychology, human service counseling, substance abuse counseling, and clinical mental health counseling. And I'm also a certified life coach. My passion has always been helping people understand that God cares about every part of who they are, the spiritual, emotional, mental, and relational aspects of your lives. One of the reasons Sacred Healing and Wholeness exist is because so many believers have been taught how to present themselves to God, but very few have been taught how to be honest with Him. Many of us have learned how to worship. We've learned how to quote scriptures. We've learned how to smile when we are hurting. We have learned how to tell everyone that we are blessed and highly favored, but we have never learned how to bring God the parts of ourselves that feels confused or disappointed or frustrated or exhausted or wounded. And so this evening I wanted to talk about something that I believe has quietly hindered the healing journey of so many believers. I want to talk about the fear of being honest with God. Not honest with your pastor, not honest with your spouse, not honest with your friends, but being honest with God. Because if we are being truthful, there are moments in life when faith raises questions. There are moments when prayers seem unanswered. There are moments when circumstances make absolutely no sense. There are moments when God feels silent. There are moments when our hearts ache in ways that words cannot fully describe. And somewhere along the way, many believers were given the impression that having questions meant they lacked faith. And so that struggling meant that they were spiritually weak, or that crying meant they were not trusting God enough, that wrestling emotionally somehow maybe even offended God. But I wanted to challenge that belief today, because the God revealed throughout Scripture repeatedly invites people into honest conversation. The Bible's filled with people who questioned, people who wrestled, people who cried, people who lamented, people who did not understand what God was doing. And yet God did not abandon them because they were honest. He met them in their honesty. And so one of the greatest misconceptions in faith communities is the idea that spiritual maturity means becoming emotionally unaffected. That is not maturity. That is often emotional suppression dressed up in religious language. Spiritual maturity is not pretending that pain does not hurt. Spiritual maturity is bringing your pain to God instead of running from God. And so there is a difference. Many people spend years trying to become the polished version of themselves before approaching God. They bring Him the cleaned up version, the edited version, the socially accepted version, the version that sounds spiritual. But healing cannot happen in places where honesty is absent. I want you to think about that for a moment. Healing cannot happen where honesty is absent. And so if I go to a doctor and hide my symptoms, the doctor cannot properly help me. If I sit in counseling and refuse to discuss what is actually hurting me, progress then becomes limited. If I attend coaching sessions but avoid the real issues, transformation will be delayed. And so the same principle applies spiritually. God already knows what's happening inside of us. He's not asking for information. God is inviting you and I to a place of honesty. And there's something powerful that happens when we stop trying to impress God and start engaging Him authentically. The truth is that many believers are carrying private questions. questions about suffering, questions about loss, questions about disappointments, questions about relationships, questions about prayers that seem unanswered, questions about dreams that have not come to pass, questions about doors that close unexpectedly, questions about seasons that lasted for longer than expected. And because they fear judgment, they carry those questions silently. But God is not intimidated by your questions. And so I want that to be very, very clear. He's not intimidated by your questions. Your questions do not threaten his sovereignty. Your confusion doesn't diminish his power. Your uncertainty doesn't make him nervous. Your emotional struggles do not weaken God's ability to sustain you. God is secure enough to handle your honesty. I believe that one of the healthiest realizations a believer can have is understanding that God's love for us is not dependent upon our ability to appear emotionally composed, because God is not waiting for you to become emotionally perfect before he draws you near. He meets people in grief. God meets people in fear, in confusion, and disappointment. He meets people in seasons when when they barely have words. And so sometimes the most spiritual prayer a person can pray is simply, God, I do not understand. Sometimes the holiest thing that you can say is just to say, God, I'm struggling. Sometimes the most honest prayer you can pray is, God, I need help. And it's that kind of honesty becomes the doorway to healing. One of the things I've learned both in ministry and in counseling is that people often fear emotions because they believe emotions are indicators of failure. And that's just not 100%, that's just not true. Um, but emotions, because emotions are not failures, emotions are actually signals. Emotions are information. Emotions reveal what is happening internally. Emotions alert us to wounds. Emotions identify needs. Emotions actually expose areas requiring attention. And so ignoring your emotions does not make them disappear. It simply forces them underground. And what gets buried alive rarely stays buried. Eventually, it resurfaces. It resurfaces through anxiety, through irritability, exhaustion, emotional numbness, unhealthy coping patterns, relational conflict, through spiritual discouragement. And so, this is why Sacred Healing and Wholeness emphasizes bringing our whole selves before God. Not just your strength, not just your victories, not just your testimonies, but our struggles. And so the goal is not to become people who never struggle. The goal is to become people who know where to take your struggles. And that's a completely different conversation. And so as we continue tonight, I want you to begin asking yourself a simple question. What part of my story have I been afraid to bring before God honestly? Right? Not because he doesn't know, because he's all knowing, but because I have been afraid to say it out loud. That question may reveal more about your healing journey than you actually realize. And so, next, I want to take a few minutes to talk about why lament is one of the most overlooked pathways to emotional and spiritual healing in the life of a believer, right? Um, Many believers are familiar with praise, we're familiar with worship, we're familiar with thanksgiving, we're familiar with declarations and affirmations. But very few Christians or very few believers have been taught how to lament. And as a result, many people know how to celebrate with God, but they don't know how to suffer with Him. And so lament is not complaining. Lament is not unbelief. It's not rebellion. Lament is the sacred practice of bringing pain, whatever hurts you, whatever causes your soul to be not at ease, to bring pain in the presence of God rather than carrying it alone. And so lament says, God, this hurts. God, I don't understand. Lament says, God, this is not what I expected. God, I need you to meet me right here. And I want you to notice something important. Lament does not run from God. Lament actually runs to him. Lament will cause you to fall in the arms of God. And so that distinction really matters. Many believers Many people believe faith means never acknowledging pain, but biblical faith repeatedly demonstrates something totally different. Faith acknowledges pain while remaining connected to God. And so one of the greatest threats to healing is not pain itself, it's isolation. Because pain is difficult, but isolation will make pain heavier. Pain is absolutely challenging, but isolation will make pain lonelier. Pain may wound us, but isolation often deepens the wound. And so, one of the enemy's most effective strategies is convincing people to suffer where? To suffer in silence, to smile publicly while struggling privately, to appear strong while falling apart internally, to convince themselves that if they were really spiritual, they would not be feeling what they are feeling. But healing rarely occurs in those kind of hidden spaces, in that isolation. Healing begins when honesty enters the room. And so I've discovered something over the years that many believers, many Christians have no problem bringing God their success. We gladly tell God about the promotion. We thank Him for the blessings. We celebrate answered prayers. We rejoice over breakthroughs. But when disappointment enters the picture, we become strangely silent. We stop talking honestly. We start censoring ourselves. We begin editing our conversations with God. And yet, the very thing we are trying to hide is the thing that God is inviting us to bring closer. I want you to just take a second and think about that. The place where you are hurting may be the exact place where God desires to meet you most deeply. The place you are confused may be the exact place where He wants to reveal Himself differently to you. The place where you are struggling may become the place where your relationship with Him actually grows stronger. Not because suffering is enjoyable, not because pain is desirable, but because honesty creates intimacy. You cannot have deep intimacy where there is constant performance. Why? Because performance only impresses people, but honesty creates a connection. And this is true in marriages, in friendships, in counseling relationships. It's also true in our relationship with God. And so many people spend years performing spiritually. They know the right words, they know the right responses, they know the expected answers. But beneath the surface, they feel disconnected because they have never learned how to be fully known. And so the reality is that God cannot be shocked by what He already knows. And so your questions do not surprise Him. Your disappointments don't surprise Him. Your confusion, your anger, your grief, your exhaustion, they don't surprise God, because God is not sitting in heaven saying, I had no idea you felt that way, because He's all knowing. He already knows. And so the invitation is not for His benefit. The invitation is for yours, because healing begins when what has been hidden finally becomes acknowledged. And one of the challenges I often give people is this: stop trying to sound spiritual in your private prayers. Just talk. Tell God the truth. If you're tired, say you're tired. If you're confused, say you're confused. If you are disappointed, say you're disappointed. If you feel abandoned, tell Him. If you're angry about what happened, tell Him. He is your Father and He is your friend. Not because God needs the information, but because honesty opens the door to deeper healing. One of the unfortunate things that sometimes happens in faith communities is that people learn to suppress emotions instead of processing their emotions. And so suppression and processing are not the same. Suppression says, I refuse to acknowledge this. But processing says, I am willing to face this now. Suppression pushes emotions underground. But processing brings those emotions to the light. Suppression will oftentimes create pressure, but processing is going to cause you to move, make some decisions, make some choices. Suppression says, this doesn't bother me, but processing says, this hurts. And I need to understand why. And so the goal is not emotional indulgence. The goal is emotional awareness. There is a difference. Emotional awareness simply means paying attention to what is happening within you. It means recognizing patterns. It means noticing triggers. It means identifying needs. It means becoming curious about your internal experiences rather than ashamed of how you feel on the inside. And so, one practical exercise I want to give you for the rest of this week is something I call honest prayer journal. And so, I just want to challenge you that you take 2 to 5 minutes a day and write a short note to God. Not a polished prayer, not a church prayer, not a public prayer, but just a short, simple, it could be a 2 sentence, a 2 liner, an honest prayer. I want you to write exactly what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you are struggling with. And do not worry about sounding spiritual. Don't worry about using religious language. Simply be honest. The goal is just to be honest. Many people are surprised by what surfaces when they finally give themselves permission to stop editing. And so you may discover fears you have ignored. You might discover some grief you have avoided. You may discover some disappointments that you have minimized. You may discover wounds that still need healing. And that awareness becomes valuable information because you cannot bring to God what you refuse to acknowledge. Another practical challenge that I'd like to offer is this. Pay attention to what you keep telling yourself to just get over. You need to just get over it. Those words often reveal areas where compassion is needed. Sometimes people are carrying wounds that have never been grieved, losses that have never been acknowledged, disappointments that have never been processed. And because they never slow down long enough to address them, the pain simply followed them into the next season. So healing does not happen because time passes. I don't know why people say time heals all wounds. That is not true. That is absolutely not true. There's data, there's studies that prove otherwise. Healing happens because we intentionally engage what needs intention. Time may create distance from an event, from the situation, from the circumstances, but healing is going to require some participation. And that participation often starts with your honesty. And so, really quickly, I want to explore a difficult but necessary truth. Why many believers feel guilty for struggling and how shame often becomes one of the biggest obstacles to emotional and spiritual healing. Um, Many people are not just carrying pain, they're carrying shame about their pain. And there is a difference. The wound hurts, but the shame that is often attached to the wound often can hurt or cause even greater or more pain. The loss hurts, the disappointment hurt, the betrayal, the unanswered prayers, the season of waiting, they all hurt. But then shame comes along and whispers something very dangerous. It says, you shouldn't still feel this way. You should be stronger by now. You should be further along by now. You should have healed already. You should have more faith than this. And suddenly the original pain, what really caused the hurt, is no longer now the only problem. And so now, in essence, you are fighting yourself. Now you are carrying the burden of self judgment. Now you are trying to heal while simultaneously criticizing yourself for even needing healing. And so that is an exhausting way to live. One of the things that I often observe is that believers will extend grace to everyone except to themselves. They understand God's mercy, intellectually at least. They understand God's compassion theologically. They understand God's forgiveness biblically, but they struggle to apply those same truths personally. They believe God can be patient with other people. They just are not convinced God is patient with them. So every struggle becomes evidence that they are failing. Every setback becomes evidence that they are broken. Every difficult season becomes evidence that something must be wrong with them spiritually. And over time, they develop a relationship with themselves that is rooted in criticism rather than in compassion. And so I want you to think about how many people spend years praying for peace while simultaneously attacking themselves internally with that negative internal dialogue. Imagine trying to rest while someone constantly criticizes you. Imagine trying to heal while someone is constantly reminding you of your failures. Imagine trying to grow while someone continually tells you that you should already be further along. That can be exhausting, yet so many people do exactly that inside their own minds every single day. And so, one of the greatest acts of healing is learning to stop becoming the enemy of your own growth. Growth requires patience. You've got to be patient with yourself. Growth requires grace. You've got to show yourself some grace. Growth requires room for imperfection. And so when a child is learning to walk, we celebrate progress. We don't condemn the stumbles. We don't criticize every fall. We don't expect mastery on the first attempt. We understand that development is a process. Yet somehow, as adults, often we often refuse to extend our own selves the same patience that you would gladly extend to a child. We expect immediate mastery, immediate healing, immediate understanding, immediate emotional stability. And when that doesn't happen, we become frustrated with ourselves. But healing does not work that way. Healing is often slower than people expect, not because God is withholding the breakthrough, but because growth takes place layer by layer. Many wounds were not created overnight. Many patterns were not formed overnight. Many fears were not developed overnight. And often healing unfolds gradually rather than instantly. One of the reasons people become discouraged is because they mistake awareness for failure. And let me explain what I mean. You begin noticing unhealthy patterns, or you recognize emotional triggers, or you become aware of insecurities. You start to identify old wounds. And instead of celebrating in your increased awareness, you become discouraged by what you see. You think something is wrong because now you are noticing things you did not notice before. But awareness is typically evidence of growth or evidence of improvement. And so the fact that you can identify the patterns mean you are becoming more conscious. The fact that you can recognize the trigger means you are paying attention. The fact that you can name the wound means you are moving toward healing. You cannot heal what you cannot identify. And so awareness is not the problem. Awareness is often the beginning of transformation. One of the practical tools I teach people is something called naming without judging. And so I think it's a pretty cool exercise. When you notice an emotion, simply name it. And so it goes something like this: I feel disappointed. I feel afraid. I feel overwhelmed. I feel frustrated. I feel lonely. Notice what happens. You are acknowledging the emotion without attacking yourself for having it. And so many people skip directly from feeling something to criticizing themselves for feeling it. But what if you simply noticed it? What if you simply just acknowledged it? What if you gave yourself permission to be honest without immediately becoming critical? And so that small shift can be incredibly healing. Another reason shame keeps people stuck is because shame convinces people they are alone. Shame isolates. It tells people that everyone else is doing better. Everyone else is stronger. Everyone else has more faith. Everyone else has it figured out. But that is rarely the truth. And so one of the most healing experiences a person can have have is discovering they are not the only one. You are not the only one who struggles. You are not the only one who worries or who feels discouraged or who questions. You're not the only one who has cried themselves to sleep. You're not the only one who has feel exhausted. You're not the only one who has wondered when things would finally change. So isolation loses its power when truth enters the room. And so this is one reason healthy community matters so much. Healing was never designed to happen entirely in isolation. We need safe spaces. We need authentic conversations. We need relationships where people can tell the truth. We need environments where people do not have to pretend, because pretending may protect your image, but it rarely promotes your healing. And so one of the greatest dangers in faith communities is confusing image management with spiritual growth. Because image management says, make sure nobody knows you're struggling. But spiritual growth says, bring your struggles to God and allow Him to work within them. Image management prioritizes appearance, but spiritual growth prioritizes your transformation. Image management says, how do I look? Transformation asks, how am I actually doing? How am I feeling? And those are very different questions. And so many people have become experts at appearing fine. They know how to smile, they know how to serve, they know how to perform, they know how to encourage others, but they have never learned how to admit when they need encouragement themselves. They have never learned how to acknowledge their own awareness. They have never learned how to receive support. But a part of healing is recognizing that strength and vulnerability are not opposites. You can be strong and honest. You can be faithful and struggle. You can trust God and still have questions. You can love God and still feel disappointed. You can be growing and still have wounds. You can be healing and still have difficult days. Those realities can coexist at the same time. One does not cancel out the other. In fact, some of the strongest people I have ever met are not people who never struggle. They are people who learned how to remain honest while they were struggling. They stopped measuring faith by emotional perfection. They stopped measuring spirituality by the absence of difficulty. They stopped measuring growth by whether they ever felt pain again. Instead, they learned to measure growth differently. Can I recognize what I'm feeling? Can I bring it before God? Can I respond with greater awareness? Can I show myself grace while continuing to grow? Can I stay engaged in the healing process? And so those questions reveal far more about maturity than pretending everything is fine. Amen. And so this week I wanted to take a piece. I want you to take a piece of paper, if you have one, and write down every statement that begins with I should. So you just write down the words I should. And each statement that comes after that, I want you to write it down. For example, I should be over this. I should be stronger. I should have healed by now. And I should know better. I should not feel this way. I should have figured this out. But after you write down your I should statements, then I want you to ask yourself, who taught me that? Who taught me that? Where did that belief come from? Is that expectation realistic? Would I say that same thing to someone I love? And I think you may be surprised by what you discover, because sometimes the standards we are using to judge others did not come from God at all. Sometimes they came from culture and society. Sometimes they came from our family systems that we were raised in. Sometimes they came from unhealthy environments. Sometimes they came from perfectionism. And sometimes they come from fear. And so the goal is not to lower the standards. The goal is to remove shame from the growth process, because growth flourishes in grace. We've got to have more grace with self. I'm not talking about what you have for outsiders, with your family, with your friends, but I'm talking about the kind of grace. What do you have for yourself? and healing flourishes in honesty. And so, as we continue, we're going to examine why emotional honesty is not the enemy of faith, but one of the pathways that I believe God often uses to deepen our trust in Him. And so, as we continue this conversation, I want to address something that has quietly affected so many believers for years: the belief that faith and emotional honesty are somehow in competition with one another. Many people have taught directly or indirectly, that if they were truly trusting God, they would not feel what they feel. If they were really walking by faith, they would not struggle emotionally. If they were spiritually mature, they would not experience doubt, disappointment, confusion, grief, frustration, or fear. And as a result, many people spend enormous amounts of time and energy trying to suppress emotions they believe they should not have. The problem is that feelings do not disappear simply because we decide they are inconvenient. What we refuse to acknowledge often finds another way to express itself. Ignored grief becomes heaviness. Unprocessed disappointment becomes cynicism. Unaddressed fear becomes anxiety. Suppressed anger becomes irritability. Chronic emotional exhaustion becomes numbness. And eventually, people find themselves wondering why they feel disconnected from God, why they feel disconnected from people, why they even feel disconnected from themselves. One of the things I often tell people is that God created human beings with human emotions on purpose. It wasn't an accident. It was a part of his divine plan. And so emotions are not evidence that something is wrong. They are a part of being human. God did not create us as machines. He created us as emotional beings. We celebrate emotionally. We connect emotionally. We love emotionally. We experience joy emotionally. We experience grief emotionally. Emotions are a part of the human experience. The problem is not having emotions. The problem is allowing emotions to become our only source of guidance. And there is a difference. Feelings are real, feelings are important, but feelings are not always complete. Feelings provide information. They're not always providing the entire story, though. And so, this is why emotional honesty and spiritual wisdom work together. Emotional honesty allows us to acknowledge what we feel, but spiritual wisdom helps us to determine what to do with what we feel. Both are necessary. One without the other creates imbalance. And so, if we ignore emotions completely, we lose valuable information. If we allow emotions to completely control our decisions, we may lose perspective. And so healthy growth requires both awareness and wisdom. One of the greatest misunderstandings about faith is that many people think faith means denying reality. Faith does not deny reality. Faith acknowledges reality while trusting God with it. And so there is a significant difference. Faith does not say, I'm not hurting. Faith says, I'm hurting, but God is with me. Faith does not say, I'm not afraid, but faith says, I'm afraid, but I will not allow fear to make all of my decisions. Faith does not say I have no questions. Faith says I have questions, but I'm bringing them to God. Faith does not require pretending. Faith requires your trust. And trusting is very different from pretending. Many believers have spent years pretending they are okay, pretending they're not affected, pretending they're not tired, pretending they're not struggling, pretending that they're not disappointed, pretending they are not grieving, pretending that they're not overwhelmed, but pretending never produces healing. And so pretending may preserve appearances, but pretending may protect image. Pretending may keep people from asking questions, but pretending rarely leads to transformation or healing. And so transformation begins when truth enters the room. One of the reasons emotional honesty strengthens faith is because honesty eliminates the distance that performance will create. I want you to think about any meaningful relationship that you may have. Real intimacy requires honesty. Imagine trying to build a relationship while hiding everything. Imagine trying to build a marriage while concealing every struggle. Imagine trying to develop trust while never sharing what is actually happening. That relationship would simply remain shallow. Not because the connection was unavailable, but because honesty was absent. And so the same principles apply spiritually. Many people desire deeper intimacy with God, but intimacy requires honesty. You cannot be deeply known while continually hiding. You cannot experience authentic connection while constantly performing, and you cannot receive comfort in areas you refuse to acknowledge. And it's so silly because God already knows. The invitation is not about informing God, right? The invitation is about allowing yourself to be fully present before God. And so, one of the most healing realizations a believer can have is this: God's love does not increase when I am doing well. And God's love does not decrease when I'm struggling. I want you to let that settle in for a moment. Because many people live as though God's affection rises and falls based upon their emotional condition. And when they feel strong, they assume God is pleased. When they feel weak, they assume God is disappointed. When they feel confident, they assume God is near. When they feel overwhelmed, they assume God is distant. But God's presence is not determined by your emotional state. His faithfulness is not dependent on your emotional consistency. His love is not threatened by your difficult season. His commitment to you does not disappear because life became hard. Sometimes people assume that because they feel disconnected, they are disconnected. But feelings are not always accurate indicators of reality. And so this is why emotional honesty matters. Emotional honesty allows us to say, I feel abandoned, without automatically concluding that you have been abandoned. Do you hear the difference? One statement describes an emotion, the other statement assumes a fact. Learning that distinction can be life changing because emotions communicate experiences. Emotions do not always communicate objective truth. And so the goal is not to reject your emotions. The goal is to listen carefully to your emotions. The goal is to learn from your emotions. The goal is to become curious about your emotions. The goal is to understand what they may be revealing to you about you. And so another practical tool I want to share with you today is called what I call emotional naming. Research consistently shows that when people accurately identify emotions, emotional intensities often decreases. In simple language, what we can name becomes easier to manage, in other words. And so many people use broad language. I feel bad, I feel off, I feel stressed. But what exactly are you feeling? Are you disappointed? Are you discouraged? Are you lonely? Or are you overwhelmed, frustrated, grieving, anxious, afraid? The more specifically you identify an emotion, the more clearly you'll be able to address it. And so these are just tools that you can use. So this week, I want to challenge you to pause several times each day and ask, what am I feeling right now? And then ask yourself, what happened before I started feeling this way? What might this emotion be trying to tell me? Notice that none of those questions involve judgment. They involve awareness. Awareness does what? Awareness creates opportunities. Awareness helps us respond intentionally instead of automatically. Another practical tool I want to offer is what I call the pause before the story exercise. Many people experience an emotion and immediately create a story. Someone doesn't return a text message, the story becomes, they don't care about me. A door closes unexpectedly, right? The story becomes, nothing ever works out for me. A difficult conversation occurs, and then the story or the narrative becomes, I'm failing. But what if we paused? What if we separated the event from the interpretation? What if we allowed ourselves to become curious before becoming convinced? And so that pause creates room for wisdom. When you pause, it creates room for perspective. And when you pause, it creates room for truth. And often, the pause prevents unnecessary suffering. Another challenge I want to give our Sacred Healing and Wholeness community this week is something I call the honest check in. And so for the next, I'll say 2 or 3 days, I want you to spend a couple minutes each evening asking yourself just these 4 questions. What challenged me today? What encouraged me today? What emotion showed up most often today? And what do I need from God right now? Not what you think you should need, not what sounds spiritual. What do you genuinely need from God? Is it comfort, strength, wisdom, rest, direction, peace, courage? Honesty will help to provide clarity, and clarity often becomes the starting point for our healing. So many people are trying to solve problems they have not clearly identified. And so, the more honest we become, the clearer things will become. And the clearer things become, the easier it becomes to respond intentionally. One of the things I hope Sacred Healing and Wholeness continues teaching people is that healing is not about becoming emotionalist. Healing is about becoming emotionally aware, emotionally healthy, spiritually grounded, and increasingly whole. And so the goal is not perfection, the goal is integration. The goal is bringing all parts of ourselves into an alignment with God and His perfect plan for man. The goal is becoming people who no longer have to divide life into spiritual parts versus emotional parts. Because the truth is that God cares about all of it. He cares about your prayer life, your thought life, your emotional life, your relationships, your grief, your fears, your questions, your struggle. And He invites every part of you into relationship with Him. And so as we move into these last couple of minutes, we're going to bring everything together. We're going to discuss what it looks like to bring your whole heart to God, develop a practical healing rhythm, and walk away with a challenge that can help you begin practicing emotional honesty immediately. And so, as I begin to bring it to a close, I want to return to the central truth we've been discussing throughout our time. And the central truth is this: God is not intimidated by your questions. He's not intimidated. He's not intimidated by your fears, your tears, your struggles, your disappointment, your confusion. He is not intimidated by the parts of your story that you wish looked different. He's not intimidated by the places you still need healing. And for some of you, that may be the most important thing you hear today, because so many of us believers have spent years trying to become presentable before approaching God, have spent years trying to clean ourselves up emotionally before talking to Him, have spent years believing that you needed stronger faith before you could be honest, years attempting to become healed enough, matured enough, disciplined enough, spiritual enough, or stable enough before bringing your authentic selves into God's presence. But relationships do not work that way. Imagine if your only if your child only came to you when everything was going well. Imagine if your child only called when they had good news, or only talked to you when they were succeeding. You would immediately recognize that something important was missing from the relationship, because healthy relationships make room for the difficult conversations. Healthy relationships make room for tears, and make room for confusion, make room for questions, make room for struggle. And if that is true in human relationships, how much more is it true in our relationship with God? One of the greatest invitations God extends to us is the invitation to stop performing and start relating. So many people have become experts at presenting themselves, experts at image management, experts at appearing strong, expert at appearing unbothered, experts at appearing spiritually mature. But healing often begins when we stop asking, how do I appear? And start asking, how am I actually doing? How am I feeling? That is a different question, and it requires courage because honesty can feel vulnerable. Honesty can feel uncomfortable. Honesty can feel risky, especially for people who have spent years protecting themselves, people who have learned to survive by suppressing emotions, or people who have been hurt when they were vulnerable in the past. But what if the thing you have been avoiding is actually the doorway to greater freedom? What if the tears you've been holding back need to be released? What if the questions you've been afraid to ask needed to be spoken? What if the disappointments you've been minimizing needs to be acknowledged? What if the struggles you've been hiding needs compassion instead of criticism? Sometimes we assume healing requires doing more praying or more studying or more striving or more effort. And while spiritual disciplines certainly do matter, sometimes healing begins with something much simpler. Sometimes healing simply starts with your honesty, your willingness just to be truthful. Sometimes healing begins with finally telling the truth, not because God doesn't already know, He's all knowing, but because we finally stop pretending. One of the things I often remind people is that healing is not the same thing as never hurting again. Healing doesn't mean life suddenly becomes painless, or disappointments never come, or grief disappears, or challenges stop occurring. Healing means developing the capacity to move through life's difficulties with greater awareness, greater resilience, greater wisdom, and a greater connection to God. And so that is very different. Many people are waiting for a day when they never feel sad again, or never feel frustrated again, or disappointed again. But emotional health is not the absence of emotions. Emotional health is learning how to respond to emotions in healthy ways. Emotional health is learning how to acknowledge what you feel without becoming controlled by what you feel. It's learning how to bring emotions to God rather than allowing emotions to drive every decision. It's learning how to stay connected to yourself, connected to God, and connected to truth even during difficult seasons. And that is a skill that can be developed, a skill that can be strengthened, and a skill that can be practiced. That is one of the reasons Sacred Healing and Wholeness exists, because healing is rarely a one-time event. Healing is a journey of learning, growth, discovery, a journey of becoming. And journeys are not completed in a single step. They are completed one step at a time, one conversation at a time, one healthy choice at a time, one moment of awareness at a time, one act of courage at a time, one day at a time. And so I want to leave you with this practical rhythm that you can begin implementing immediately. For the next couple of days, I want you to set aside a couple minutes each day, not to perform, not to impress God, not to create the perfect devotional moment, simply to practice honesty. Begin with a simple prayer. God, help me tell the truth. Then ask yourself these questions. What am I carrying today? What am I worried about? What am I grieving? What am I avoiding? And what do I need from God right now? And then write your answers down. Don't edit your answers. Don't judge them. Do not try to make them sound spiritual. Just tell the truth. And then spend a few moments sitting quietly, not trying to fix everything, not trying to solve everything, just allowing yourself to be present. So many people have never experienced what it feels like to sit with God without performing. And so I want you to experience that. I want you to experience what it feels like to be loved without pretending. I want you to experience what it feels like to be accepted without performing, to be seen without hiding, because that is where healing often begins. And so I want to thank you for spending this time with me here at Sacred Healing and Wholeness, where biblical truth and mental health science work together in harmony. And so if today's lessons encouraged you, challenged you, helped you see yourself differently, I want to personally invite you to become a part of our Sacred Healing and Wholeness community. This is a safe space for people who are serious about healing, about growth, about emotional wellness, spiritual maturity, and living whole. Together, we explore practical mental health tools through a biblical lens, engaged in meaningful discussions, participate in weekly challenges, and create space for honest conversations that many people never get the opportunity to have. You don't have to walk your healing journey alone. You don't have to figure everything out by yourself. You don't have to keep carrying what was never meant to be carried in isolation. So join us inside Sacred Healing and Wholeness community, where faith and healing meet, where growth is encouraged, where honesty is welcome, and where becoming whole is the goal. Until next time, remember this: God is not intimidated by your questions. God is not intimidated by your struggles or your tears. Bring God your whole heart, not just the polished parts of you. Take care of yourself. Extend yourself some grace and keep moving forward one honest step at a time. I'll see you next time. Sacred Healing and Wholeness. I'm Pastor Amy. Have a great evening.